I'm
Um,
curious, with the polymetric polyrhythmic studies, I
ah,
feel like that's been described as your theoretical work. I don't know if you think of it that way, but is that sort of in that San Francisco timeframe?
um, yeah, I guess so. I'm not sure. Um,
Sure.
it was just something that I was very sort of intrigued. I was very intrigued by that, and
Mhm,
so to some extent, it came from my involvement with the Balkan odd meter,
mhm,
and then sort of figuring out that actually the Balkan odd meter can also be polyrhythmic or polymetric.
mhm.
So I started doing more and more of these kinds of things, so like say 2 times 9, 18, and then 3 times 6. So then I would combine with 3 bars of 6/8 and then 2 bars of 9, and then sort of combine like different types of uh, different types of divisions, subdivisions, and stuff like that. And then there was this piece that I wrote for, maybe Michael Newman Altman duo in New York. It's a
Maybe.
guitar,
Oh, no, no,
classical
no, I don't.
guitar, but that's okay. It's okay. I mean, you can't do everything. Anyway, they commissioned me at some point, and I wrote this piece for two guitars and string quartet. So there, I just really kind of went berserk with all these polyrhythms and stuff. So,
Mhm.
but I wrote actually a book. It was kind of like a textbook about polyrhythmic exercises, and that was really I don't know, it was just for myself,
Mm.
in a way to kind of to clear up these things in my head, because I was using them, and then I thought, well, why don't I make something a bit more systematic,
Mhm.
so then I systematized a bit more, and I like systematizing. I guess it's like something I like to do
Right.
sometimes. I like making categories, and then sort of analysis is something that I enjoy doing. Not always, but sometimes.
Mhm.
So anyway, so that was part of what I did. And then later on, I discovered, like, say, Ligetti's studies for piano,
Mhm.
which are like an incredible feat of
Yes.
precisely of polyrhythms, etc. But actually, I didn't know anything about that when I was doing my studies. So I was just surprised later to see that.
Mhm.
And I think it could be maybe also the background in odd meter sort of tends to kind of liberate you
Mhm.
from just sort of the regular metrics,
Right.
because you already think of meter as something kind of really sort of irregular and flexible, and so you kind of think of it as something that can move around. And then also, to some extent, African music, which was
Mhm.
very interesting for me always. um, and actually, primarily, first time I heard uh, pygmy music. It was by this Bibayak tribe from Gabon.
Mhm.
I was just absolutely stunned. I was just blown away by this stuff. It's just
I've heard from another, sort of like very
mhm.
rhythmically focused, composer who's
uh
much more of like a computer musician, Mark Fell. He's mentioned his influence from, Pygmy music, and I'm curious if you can,
Really?
point,
Yeah.
any sort of listeners towards anything that's worth checking out.
Sure, sure. That's very interesting. That's
Yeah.
very interesting. Um, what it is like I mentioned, is the Bibayak pygmies and then the Aka pygmies, and there's some other. I mean, I'm not like a total expert on this, but what I was really fascinated was the vocal polyphony,
Mm, okay.
because there's some music that is very kind of like a very discrete little rhythmical accompaniment, but actually what's the most exciting is that you get like these 4 or 5 voices,
Mm,
and they're all interlocked. They're like interlocked patterns, and it just sure, it's very repetitive and stuff, but it's like incredible. I mean, the intricacy of these things is just magnificent. And they often do yodeling as well, so it
okay.
also includes the yodel. And now that I mentioned this, I will also mention I invited this great ethnomusicologist, Simcha Aram, who is I think he's still alive. Anyway, he was the director of the French ethnomusicological, whatever it is, university or something, organization. I'm not the university. Anyway, he spent 20 years with pygmies in Central Africa, and I invited him to come to Geneva, and so he came over maybe now it must be like 8 9 years ago, and he just came over and like talked about it, and he had all these fantastic examples. So he came to Geneva and spent a week. He spent the week talking about it. So I was just really thrilled about that. I thought that was fantastic. Then he mentioned also that he influenced Ligeti to use this music in his studies, and he even mentioned Steve Reich. He said that also Steve Reich used some of his material. So I think this kind of stuff, like the polyrhythmic nature of African polyphony, is just like it's like an incredible source of interest. And sure, if you look at Herbie Hancock, did his Headhunters, like the beginning of funk, like his funk. I mean, that was already to some extent influenced by African tribal music, probably by Pygmy music too. I'm not completely sure.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so that was one of the very exciting things. Now, this polyrhythmic stuff didn't really come to me as an abstract thing. It was just that I noticed that I was getting more and more involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I wrote this book, finally, just to kind of, just to clear it up and to make it a bit more kind of, maybe to make it more abstract in a way,
And this is the polymetric book or the rhythm book?
Yeah.
Is that published or?
Oh yeah, a long time ago.
Oh,
it's just like from '86, maybe. I think I wrote it '86.
I guess I always thought that was only the etudes. I've never seen this.
Yeah. No. Well, it's actually no. These are actually these are series of studies, but they're all kind of like categorized. They're categorized, and they have first like simple studies,
Mm-hmm.
and then after that come like these more complicated studies.
Gotcha.
Apart from that, I wrote another thing called Ex Solvo,
Mm-hmm.
which was kind of like out of an egg. So it's kind of, the idea was you use a motif, and then what can you do with one motif? So that's been kind of like my eternal theme, so to say, is just, I had this idea. I was thinking one day, I thought I was looking at this hokusai, hokusai, maybe the Japanese. No. Anyway,
I'll know some of the
like
things that you
this. No, it's okay. It's okay. There's this beautiful Japanese wood prints, and they're called 36 Views of Mount Fuji. And so what he has these 36 different views of Mount Fuji, and in each one of them there is Mount Fuji, but completely on some of them it's just tiny, you can barely see it, and some of them you're at the bottom of the Mount Fuji. So it was kind of like angles and perspectives on the same thing. And so that got me thinking a lot about how can I make some kind of a transformation of the same motif, like having just one subject, one object, and then through how many different systems you can sort of run this one object. And so that's where I started working on these different kinds of transformations. And so this gets kind of technical, so I don't know if I need to get into this, but
well, I generally like to pride myself on having this podcast not simplify anything for the layperson. We can get as technical as you want. It will give me greater joy.
Okay, why not? Well, then I'll be a little bit technical. I'm not going to get too technical, but so what it is, the idea was this: in these different kinds of transformations, I would first distinguish there is interpretation, there is variation, and then there is transformation. So interpretation is when you interpret the same sort of pattern in different systems.
Okay.
So what that means is, for example, you have, let's say, just some kind of a pattern, say pam, pa, pa, pam, pam, or something like that. Now, you can interpret this in various sort of meters. It could be just like a 3/4. It could be like a 3/16. It could be a 5. It could be 7. It could be 9.
Mhm.
So anyway, so that was one of the ideas, was that you have the same skeletons, so to say,
Mhm.
and then you interpret it differently. And the same thing with the melody. This melody could be actually interpreted in various kind of harmonic or melodic contexts. So that's been a great interest for me. I find that absolutely fascinating, that you can have the same pattern,
Mhm.
the same theme, the same melody, and you can run it through like a huge amount of different systems of reference.
Mhm.
I think that's kind of pretty clear. Then after that, you have technical variation, which Simon Haram, in his book about the African polyphony, he mentions variation is kind of like an African way of varying motifs. So that's also kind of like a transformation of the motif, but it's not necessarily systematic. It's kind of like you have a certain number of variants, and then you just sort of like improvise essentially those variants. But there is always a certain number of variants. And then some other very interesting things like that. There is this called commutation principle, where you have two patterns, and then one pattern remains constant, and then the other pattern keeps on changing. So I've used that in a lot of my music, actually. So say you just have a pump. Let's say you have pump, pump, pump. So let's say this pump, pump stays the same. You can do pump, 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 pump. So one pattern stays the same, and then the other is permanently changed. Then you can change both of them. So anyway, this was kind of like my research into this different types of transformation. Then I got more into like research into phasing,
Okay.
which is like essentially the kind of stuff that Steve Reich did, which is also extremely interesting. And again, in African music, there is a lot of this moving from the downbeat to the upbeat, so that the same phrase is kind of interpreted differently. And then there are various other things like additives, subtractive. So where you're kind of taking certain notes from the motif and then you're adding certain notes, and then there are other kinds of other sort of transformations. So anyway, the whole text is really about transformation. But how do you transform one motif? And in a way that have stayed with me, all these years, and perhaps that's one of the things that where I would say I have facility in kind of going from one language to another.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I don't have anything like so kind of fixed or established as my own kind of quote unquote language, or I don't know, style is too vague. Let's say language.
Okay.
So, yeah, a lot of my things, like maybe 50%, is tied to the Balkan music and, to the odd metrics and things. But then there's a lot of other stuff which really kind of goes into different areas, also into more abstract areas. And when I was younger, when I was a student, I used to write just atonal music. That's all I ever wrote. It was just
I'd like to hear what
serial.
That sounds like.
Pardon?
Yeah, I'd like to hear what some earlier compositions of yours that are in an atonal style would sound like. It sounds unexpected to me.
Yeah, I know. Well, I still have certain pieces. I have something for piano, 6 Richard cars for piano, which was, for example, premiered relatively recently, maybe 5-6 years ago. And this is kind of like somewhere on the edge. It's kind of, sometimes my music sort of like a hints at tonality or modality, and then sometimes it goes over, sometimes it stays. But anyway, yeah. So my background as a composer was really, kind of an atonal composer. I used a lot of serial music, and that's what I was studying at that time, and also influences of Bartok, Stravinsky, and all that.
You said something in a different interview that I thought was interesting, and you mentioned that like the odd meters of Balkan music aren't really polyrhythms, although people, like think
No,
of them as that basically because it's just like, difficult rhythmic thing. But then you mentioned
right.
African music, and it seems
Hmm.
like African music is a lot more about the division of time than the multiplication of time. Like it's
Hmm.
more like
Okay.
more tuplety sort of like divisions of time. And I'm curious if that like
Hmm.
is anything that you think about, like sort of like I guess like the I don't know, like sort of like the overtones of tuplets, or like just dividing instead of multiplying rhythms.
Um, well, I'm not really sure.
It's not a
I
very
view it
clear
more.
question, but
Yeah, no, 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 no. But I understand what you're saying. I
yeah.
understand. I think I understand what you mean. Yeah.
Mhm.
You know what? I think like part of what I do is kind of like locked in rhythms. That
Mhm.
is to say, you're dealing with kind of regular units. With these regular units, so there's a various sort of levels of complexity or division, subdivision, etc.
Mhm.
But then I also worked a lot with kind of quasi improvised music, which is more functioning like along lines of sextuplets, quintuplets, etc. So
Mhm.
sometimes I combine the both. So sometimes you have like regular rhythmic divisions, and then at the same time you have these irregular ones.
Mhm.
Um, I just view all of this as a kind of like a real free space. It's kind of like a is just sort of like open there, and then you just go and you just sort of go along with what's going on, and then whatever works really the best. I mean, you just follow that.
Mhm.